He called me a glorified taste tester, said it in front of 3 national distributors during a facility tour, smiled when he said it too, like he'd rehearsed the line in his bathroom mirror that morning. I was the only man alive who knew the yeast culture that made their bourbon worth $280 a bottle. That culture had been alive since 1947. Longer than Preston Braxton had been alive by a factor of 3. He fired me on a Thursday, October 12th, 48 hours before the autumn split. I want you to understand what that means. The autumn split is the moment you divide a living organism into separate crocks so it can propagate through winter fermentation. Get the temperature wrong by 2 degrees, get the feeding ratio off by a 1/4 tablespoon, rush it by 6 hours, and you don't get bad bourbon. You get dead yeast, and dead yeast doesn't come back. Not this strain. This strain has been kept alive through an unbroken chain of hands since Harry Truman was president. Every autumn, one man split it. For the last 29 years, that man was me. Preston Braxton fired me 48 hours before the most critical biological event in his family's entire production calendar. He didn't know that. He didn't know it because he never asked. October 12th was a cool morning, 51 degrees at 6 a.m. when I pulled into the lot. I could smell the mash from the parking gravel, corn and rye, and that faint sweetness the fermenters throw when the yeast is active and happy. I'd been smelling that smell for 38 years. It was the smell of something alive, something I kept alive, and I loved it the way some men love a garden or a dog. The conference room was on the 2nd floor of the new visitor center Preston had built with $14 million of capital that should have gone to rickhouse expansion. Glass walls, pendant lighting, a table that looked like it belonged in a Manhattan restaurant. Preston was sitting at the head of it when I walked in, 28 years old, Wharton MBA. He'd been CEO for 3.5 years. Before that, he ran a craft cocktail discovery app out of Austin, 340 users at its peak. I looked that up later. 340. He had a laptop open. He had a presentation deck on the screen behind him. The title slide said, Braxton Creek 2.0, Flavor Analytics and the Future of Craft. There was a woman from HR I didn't recognize sitting to his left with a folder. He didn't stand up. Emmett. We're moving to a flavor analytics platform for all sensory evaluation and fermentation management. Your role is being eliminated. We appreciate your years of service. He said it the way you'd cancel a subscription. I looked at him. I looked at the presentation deck behind him. I looked at the HR woman who hadn't opened the folder yet. Then I looked back at Preston. I held his eyes for a long time, long enough that he shifted in his chair, long enough that the HR woman opened the folder and closed it again. Then I stood up. I buttoned my canvas jacket, and I walked out without a word. I started at Braxton Creek when I was 17, summer of 1986. Gus Hollifield hired me to sweep rickhouse floors. Gus was the master distiller. He'd held the position since 1961. Learned from his own mentor who had run that same root cellar under a tobacco barn in Woodford County, a man whose entire practice of cold storage propagation had been forged, hiding an earlier culture through prohibition, and who brought that same discipline to the 1947 strain the moment it was captured. Gus was 63 when I started, and he moved through that distillery like a man moving through his own living room. He knew every barrel by position. He knew the temperature of the mash by the sound the fermenters made. He could tell you the proof of a distillate by rolling it between his fingers. He watched me for 2 years before he said anything more than morning and sweep under the racks, not around them. Then one afternoon in August of 1988, he handed me a mash paddle and said, "You're going to learn to feed the culture." I didn't know what that meant yet. I learned. The yeast culture at Braxton Creek wasn't like commercial yeast. You couldn't order it from a supplier. You couldn't freeze-dry it and reconstitute it. It was a living colony, a wild strain that had been captured in 1947 from the air above an open fermenter during a late September thunderstorm. Something about the barometric pressure, the humidity, the wild microflora in that specific valley. The strain produced an ester profile that gave Braxton Creek bourbon its signature. Vanilla and scorched pecan, and a finish that reviewers called Cathedral Oak. Every bottle that ever scored above 90, every allocation that sold out in hours. On every distributor who fought for shelf space, all of it traced back to 3 ceramic crocks in a temperature-controlled room that I maintained by hand. Gus taught me the way his mentor taught him. No manuals, no written protocols. Hands. He'd hold my wrist and guide the feeding spoon. He'd press my palm against the side of a crock and say, "Feel that? 2 degrees too warm. Bring the ambient down, but don't move the crock. Moving it stresses the colony." He'd wake me at 3 a.m. for the autumn split because the split had to happen when the ambient temperature in the culture room dropped below 58 degrees naturally, not by mechanical cooling. The yeast knew the difference. I know how that sounds, but after 38 years, I can tell you the yeast knew. Gus gave me his brass hydrometer in 1989. It was a precision instrument, made in Louisville by a company that went out of business in 1994. The brass had a patina that Gus said came from 40 years of bourbon vapor. He handed it to me in Eng Rick House 7 on a Wednesday evening. No ceremony. He just set it in my palm and said, "You've got the hands for this. Don't let anyone take that from you." I carried that hydrometer every day for 35 years. It was in my jacket pocket when Preston fired me. Gus died in 2006. Heart attack in the fermentation room. He was on the floor next to crock number 2 when they found him. I was the one they called. I was the one who checked the crock temperature before I checked his pulse, and I've carried that with me too, because Gus would have wanted me to check the crock first, and we both knew it. I'm telling you this part now because what came after still makes me shake my head, and I want you to understand exactly what Preston Braxton threw away before I show you what it cost him. Stay with me. After Gus died, I was the only person alive who knew the feeding schedule, the split protocol, the temperature curves, the seasonal adjustments. I'd been master distiller since 1995. 3 competitors came to me over the years with backing offers. Morrison and Whitfield in 2011, Barrett Spirits in 2015, Coleman Creek in 2019, real money, 7 figures to walk and start my own label. I said no every time, because Gus built Braxton Creek. His hands were in the walls of Rick House 7. His voice was in every crock I fed, and as long as someone in that family still cared about making bourbon instead of just selling it, I couldn't leave. Gus's son, Walter Braxton, ran the company until 2021. Walter understood bourbon. He understood patience. He understood that a 10-year barrel doesn't care about quarterly earnings calls. Walter had a stroke in March of 2021 and stepped down. The board appointed his grandson Preston because Preston had an MBA and a pitch deck, and Walter was too sick to argue. I want to tell you about what I gave up to stay. Martha and I got married in 1992. Our daughter Claire was born in 1994. The autumn split always fell during the second week of October. Claire's birthday is October 9th. For 30 consecutive years, I spent the days bracketing my daughter's birthday deep in the culture room's pre-split preparation, the cleaning of the crocks, the ambient checks, the readiness work that began days before the split itself, monitoring temperature every 90 minutes, feeding the crocks by hand at intervals Gus had calibrated to the hour. Claire turned 8 in 2002. Martha brought a piece of birthday cake to the distillery at 9 p.m. Yellow cake, chocolate frosting. Claire had picked it out herself. Martha handed it to me through the culture room door because I wouldn't let her open it all the way. The temperature exchange would stress the colony. I ate the cake standing next to crock number 3 at 9:14 p.m. while my daughter blew out candles 5 miles away. Claire's 16 in 2010. She didn't ask me to come to dinner. Martha told me later that Claire had said, "He'll be with the Crocks. It's fine." Martha repeated those words exactly. It's fine. 2 words that meant it wasn't. I missed 30 birthdays, every single one. I missed them because the yeast was alive and it needed me, and I told myself the bourbon mattered more than the cake. Claire's 30 now. She lives in Lexington. She came to the house for Thanksgiving last year, and I noticed she doesn't call the distillery your work anymore. She calls it that place. I noticed. The night Preston fired me, I sat in my truck in the Braxton Creek parking lot for 40 minutes. Engine off, windows up. The brass hydrometer was in my left hand. I turned it over and over, feeling the weight of it, the smooth patina Gus's fingers had worn into the brass before mine took over. The mash smell came through the vents, even with the engine off. Corn and rye and that sweetness. I thought about Gus on the floor next to crock number 2. I thought about Claire saying, "It's fine." I thought about 26 Autumn sleeping on a cot so a living thing could stay alive. Then I put the hydrometer back in my jacket pocket and drove home. Martha was in the kitchen. She didn't ask me how my day was. She looked at my face and looked at the clock. It was 11 a.m. on a Thursday, and I hadn't been home at 11 a.m. on a Thursday in 38 years. And she said, "How long do they have before they figure it out?" That's my wife. 29 years, and she still reads a room faster than anyone I've ever met. 48 hours, I said. Maybe less. She nodded. What do you need? The deed to the back, 40, and a phone number for a copper supplier in Louisville. She was already walking to the filing cabinet. Here's what Preston Braxton didn't know when he fired me. He didn't know the autumn split was in 48 hours. He didn't know the feeding schedule existed only in my memory. He didn't know the yeast colony was a living organism that responded to touch, temperature, and timing in ways his flavor analytics platform couldn't measure because the platform measured chemical outputs, not biological inputs. He didn't know that the 3 ceramic crocks in that room were the most valuable assets his family owned, worth more than the visitor center, more than the barrel inventory, more than the brand itself, because without that strain, Braxton Creek bourbon was just corn whiskey with a nice label. And he didn't know that I'd taken a legal swab of the culture 6 years earlier with Walter Braxton's written permission as an insurance backup in case of contamination or natural disaster. Walter had signed the authorization himself. 1 cotton swab in a sealed glass vial stored in a temperature-controlled cabinet in my garage. My property, my culture, Walter's signature on the release. Preston called me a glorified taste tester. He said it with a smile. He said it in front of Arthur Vance, who'd been distributing Braxton Creek for 35 years and had never once looked at a label before he smelled the glass first. The autumn split was in 48 hours. The replacement distiller Preston had hired, a 31-year-old with a food science degree from Michigan and 4 years at a craft brewery in Portland, had never seen a ceramic crock, had never fed a wild yeast culture, had never slept on a cot at 3 a.m. checking temperatures by pressing his palm to fired clay. I drove home at 11 a.m. on a Thursday with a brass hydrometer in my pocket and 38 years of knowledge in my hands. And Preston Braxton's billion-dollar yeast culture was 48 hours from the most critical moment of its 76-year life, with no one left alive who knew how to keep it breathing. The replacement distiller's name was Kyle Mercer. I'll give him this much. He wasn't stupid. He had a good degree and he'd done real work at that brewery in Portland. He understood fermentation in the way a textbook teaches it. Saccharomyces cerevisiae, optimal temperature ranges, attenuation curves. He knew the science. But Braxton Creek's strain wasn't science. It was memory. It was a living thing that had survived 76 years because a chain of hands understood what it needed before it needed it. Kyle Mercer had never touched a ceramic crock. He'd worked with stainless steel conical fermenters with digital thermostats and automated nutrient dosing. He walked into that culture room on Saturday morning, October 14th, with a laptop and a Bluetooth temperature probe and a feeding schedule he'd pulled from a general wild yeast propagation guide he found in a brewing database. The ambient temperature in the culture room that morning was 59 degrees, 1 degree above the split threshold. The Crocks needed to come down naturally, not mechanically. The colony could sense forced cooling. The thermal gradient was different, sharper, and it triggered a stress response that altered the ester profile for months. Gus had explained this to me by putting one hand on a crock that had been naturally cooled and one on a crock that had been mechanically cooled and saying, "This one's sleeping, that one's flinching." Kyle Mercer turned on the room's HVAC unit at 7:12 a.m. and dropped the ambient to 54 degrees in 40 minutes. He performed the split at 8:30 a.m. The protocol I used took 11 hours. It involved 6 intermediate feeding stages, each timed to the colony's visible activity level, which I read by holding a flashlight to the side of the crock and watching the bubble pattern through the glaze. Kyle's database guide recommended a 2-stage split with nutrient supplementation. He completed it in 90 minutes. By Sunday evening, crock number 1 was dead. No bubbling, no surface activity. The mash smelled like wet cardboard. Kyle checked his temperature probe, checked his notes, and assumed the crock had been compromised before the split. He logged it as a pre-existing contamination event. Crock number 2 died on Tuesday. I know this because Dale Hutchins, my assistant for 11 years, texted me a photograph at 6:47 a.m. on Wednesday, October 18th. The photo showed 2 ceramic crocks with flat gray surfaces. No foam, no movement. Dale's text said 3 words. 2 down, sorry. I was in my garage when I got that text. I had a copper pot still body clamped to the workbench, and I was soldering a line arm joint I'd been fitting since 5 a.m. The still was for Rawlings Reserve. I'd filed the LLC paperwork the morning after Preston fired me. Martha notarized it. The filing fee was $175. The copper piping cost $8,000, or $400 from a supplier in Louisville named Barrett Metal Works. The fermentation vessel, a custom ceramic crock I'd commissioned from a potter in Harrodsburg who'd made replacement vessels for 3 other Kentucky distilleries, cost $1,400. I looked at Dale's photograph for about 10 seconds. Then I set the phone face down on the workbench and went back to the line arm. Crock number 3 survived the split, barely. But survived and thrived are different words in fermentation the way they're different words in medicine. The colony was stressed. The ester production was inconsistent. Kyle adjusted the feeding ratio, doubled the nutrient load, which is what the database recommended for a stressed culture. Wild yeast isn't commercial yeast. You double the nutrients on a wild strain in stress, and you get off flavors. Acetic acid. Solvent notes. The colony eats wrong when it's scared. The first batch of bourbon produced from Crock 3's stressed fermentation went through distillation in November. It went into barrels in December. But Braxton Creek also released an annual limited batch from the spring fermentation that had been aging for 10 years. And the new make spirit they tested from the winter run was scored internally at 71. 71. On a scale where Braxton Creek had never, in my 26 years as master distiller, released anything below 92. My last batch had scored 97. The industry average for premium Kentucky straight bourbon was 85. Preston didn't release the score. He told Kyle to adjust. Kyle adjusted. He ran a second fermentation in January using Crock 3 and a modified feeding schedule he'd developed from his Portland protocols. That batch tested at 74. Now, this is the part I've been waiting to tell you. In February, Arthur Vance drove down from Cincinnati for the annual allocation tasting. Arthur had been Braxton Creek's lead national distributor since 1989. He'd built his entire premium spirits portfolio around the brand. He was 67 years old, had a handshake that could crack a walnut, and he smelled every glass before he looked at it. That was his signature. 35 years in the business, and the nose always came first. Preston had set up the tasting in the new visitor center, Pendant Lights, the Manhattan table. A flight of 4 samples, including the 74 score batch from January, yet presented in unmarked Glencairn glasses. 2 other national distributors were there, Frank Coleman from Southeast Spirits and Ted Morrison from Morrison and Whitfield. The same 3 men who'd been standing in the fermentation hall 6 months earlier when Preston had called me a glorified taste tester. Preston poured. He gave a 4-minute presentation about the flavor analytics platform, the modernization of the sensory evaluation process, the democratization of craft. His slides had gradient backgrounds and words like scalable and data-informed palette mapping. He talked for 4 minutes without pausing for a question. Frank Coleman's pen never touched his notepad. Arthur Vance picked up the 3rd glass. He swirled it, then he stopped mid-swirl. His wrist just froze. He brought it to his nose, sniffed once, sniffed again, slower. His eyebrows pulled together, not dramatic, just a small contraction, the way a man's face changes when he opens a door and the room behind it isn't the room he expected. He set the glass down on the table without tasting it. The sound it made was barely audible, just glass on wood. But in that room, under those pendant lights, with Preston's slide deck still glowing behind him, that small click carried the weight of 35 years of trust, hitting a surface and stopping. "What happened?" Arthur said. Preston smiled. "We've refined the ester profile. The platform identified an opportunity to—" "I didn't ask what you refined." Arthur's voice was the same volume it always was. He didn't need to raise it. "I asked what happened." Preston's smile held for another second. Then it didn't. "We made some adjustments to the fermentation protocols during the transition." During the transition from what? From the previous distiller's methodology to the analytics platform. Arthur looked at the glass on the table. He looked at Frank Coleman. Frank hadn't picked up any of his glasses. Ted Morrison had picked up one, tasted it, and set it down with a face I'd seen on men who've bitten into something wrong. "Where's Emmett?" Arthur said. "Emmett's role was eliminated in October. This is our new master distiller, Kyle." Preston gestured toward Kyle, who was standing by the sample table with a tablet in his hand and the expression of a man who knew exactly what the 74 score meant and was watching it unfold in real time. Kyle didn't wave. He didn't speak. I'll give him credit for that. Arthur Vance pushed his chair back 6 inches, not standing, just creating distance. "Preston," he said, "I've carried this label for 35 years because what went into that glass was something no one else could make. I built accounts on it. I staked my reputation on it. I told a lot of restaurant owners and a lot of bar managers that this bourbon was worth the price because of what a specific man did with a specific culture in a specific room." He stood up. "That glass doesn't smell like Braxton Creek. It smells like a chemistry experiment, and I'm not going to put my name next to it." Arthur Vance left the tasting room at 2:14 p.m. on a Tuesday in February. Frank Coleman followed him out 11 minutes later. Ted Morrison stayed long enough to finish his water, set his notepad on the table, still blank, and said to Preston, "You should call Emmett." Then he left too, 3 national distributors, gone in under 30 minutes. The allocation wait list in January had been 40,000 names. By March, after word spread through the bourbon community, the way word always spreads, not through press releases but through bartenders and collectors and the quiet network of people who actually taste what they sell. The wait list was at 22,000. By June, it was 14,000. By October, 1 year after Preston fired me, it was 6,000. Preston hired a consultant, a fermentation scientist from a university program in California. The consultant arrived in April, spent 3 days with crock number 3, and asked Kyle a question that Kyle couldn't answer. What's the baseline feeding schedule for this strain? Kyle showed him the general propagation guide from the brewing database, and the consultant stared at it for a long time. Then he asked, "Where's the original protocol?" "There isn't one," Kyle said. "It wasn't documented." The consultant closed his laptop. He looked at the crock. He looked at the flat, listless surface of a culture that had been alive for 76 years and was now producing bourbon that tasted like nail polish remover. "Then you need the man who knew it," the consultant said, "because I can't reverse engineer a relationship." While Braxton Creek was trying to keep a dying culture breathing, I was in my garage in Lawrenceburg, building a still from copper I'd bent by hand. The ceramic crock from Harrodsburg arrived in November. I propagated the backup swab on December 3rd using the same protocol Gus had taught me in 1988, the same wrist angle on the feeding spoon, when the same palm check on the crock wall, the same flashlight held to the glaze to read the bubble pattern. The colony took. Within 6 weeks, I had a healthy, active culture producing the ester profile I'd spent 38 years protecting. Vanilla, scorched pecan, cathedral oak. It was alive. It recognized my hands, or I recognized it. Either way, the smell that came off the crock on a January morning was the same smell I'd breathed in the Braxton Creek parking lot for 3 decades. I ran my first fermentation in February, my first distillation in March. I had 120 gallons of new make spirit in 5-gallon barrels by April, and aging in a rickhouse I built on the back 40 of our property with lumber from a sawmill in Versailles, and a concrete pad Martha and I poured ourselves on a Saturday when the ground was frozen just right. My phone rang during those months. Preston's number. Then numbers I didn't recognize. Braxton Creek's main office, their legal department, a Louisville area code I later learned was a crisis PR firm. I let them ring. 14 calls in November, 23 in December. By January, the voicemails had shifted from professional courtesy follow-up to something tighter, faster, with less air between the words. I was welding a condenser coil on a Tuesday evening when a voicemail played through my garage speaker from a Braxton Creek attorney named Howard Wells. In the background of the voicemail, I could hear an alarm. A fermentation room alarm, the kind that triggers when a crock temperature drops below threshold. Howard was speaking quickly, saying something about intellectual property and proprietary methodology, and behind his voice, that alarm was ringing steady and shrill, the sound of something alive asking for help from a room where no one understood the question. I finished the weld, pulled my gloves off, pressed delete. By spring I was ready for a small release, 300 bottles, Rawlings Reserve, my label, my name, my yeast. The brass hydrometer Gus gave me in 1989 sat on my new desk in the office Martha and I built into the corner of the rickhouse, a room with a window that looked out over the back 40, over the copper still I'd built from pipe stock, over the rickhouse filling with barrels that would age for years on land that belonged to me. I submitted a sample to the Bourbon Independent Review in April. I didn't tell anyone. I just mailed it in a padded envelope with a check for the evaluation fee, $75, and waited. The score came back on May 11th, 96. 300 bottles, priced at $340 each. I listed them on a Saturday morning through a direct sale permit Martha had filed in February. Every bottle sold within 72 hours, $102,000 in revenue before I'd built a single piece of distribution infrastructure. Arthur Vance called me the following Monday. I picked up on the second ring. "Emmett," he said, "I just tasted your bourbon." "And?" He was quiet for a moment. I could hear him breathing. 35 years in the business. He'd built empires on a nose. "It's the real thing," he said. "When can we talk?" That conversation lasted 45 minutes. By the end of it, Arthur had committed to carrying Rawlings Reserve as the anchor of his premium portfolio, starting with the fall allocation. Frank Coleman called the next day. Ted Morrison called the day after that. 3 national distributors, the same 3 who walked out of Preston's tasting room in February. The same 3 who'd stood in the fermentation hall the day Preston called me a glorified taste tester. All 3 were now on my porch in Lawrenceburg, drinking coffee Martha had brewed in a percolator she'd owned since 1993, looking out at a rick house I'd framed with my own hands. Meanwhile, in Frankfurt, a board meeting was being called at Braxton Creek Distillery. The agenda had one item, and Preston Braxton's name was on it in a way that wouldn't fit on a slide deck. The board met on June 14th, 7 directors. Walter Braxton attended by phone from his home in Midway, where a live-in nurse held the receiver because his right side still didn't work from the stroke. I wasn't there. I didn't need to be. Dale Hutchins texted me the details that evening, and the Frankfurt Business Journal published the rest within a week. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 11 minutes. The CFO, a woman named Sandra Ellis, presented the numbers first. Braxton Creek's stock had dropped 38% since October. The 40,000 name allocation wait list had collapsed to 6,000. 3 national distributors had formally terminated their agreements. And the winter production run, the $1.4 billion revenue anchor, had produced bourbon scoring in the low 70s. 2 regional chains had returned unsold inventory for the first time in the company's history. The crisis PR firm in Louisville had billed $114,000 in 4 months and issued exactly one press statement that used the phrase "evolving flavor philosophy," which trended on bourbon Twitter for 6 hours as a punchline. Sandra read every number without editorializing. She didn't need to. Numbers that size editorialize themselves. Preston spoke next. He had a new deck. The title slide said, Recovery Roadmap, Q3 Recalibration. He talked about the flavor analytics platform's learning curve. He talked about hiring a second fermentation consultant. He talked about a heritage rebranding initiative that would lean into the company's history while, and this is a direct quote from the Journal, decoupling product identity from individual personnel dependencies. He talked for 22 minutes. When he finished, the room was quiet. Then Walter Braxton's voice came through the speakerphone, thin, slower than it used to be, but clear. Preston. Yes, sir. How's Crock 3? Preston looked at Kyle Mercer, who was seated along the wall. Kyle looked at the table. We're managing it. The consultant identified a nutrient protocol that... What does it smell like? Silence. Preston. Walk down to that room right now and tell me what it smells like. More silence. The Journal reported that Preston's legal counsel leaned over and whispered something. Preston shook his head. I haven't been to the culture room recently, sir. Kyle handles... You fired the man who kept that culture alive for 26 years. You did it 48 hours before the autumn split. You didn't ask me. You didn't ask the board. You didn't walk into that room and smell what 76 years of care smells like before you decided it could be replaced with a computer program. Walter Braxton's voice broke on the word care. Not dramatically. Just the way a voice breaks when the body behind it is trying to carry something heavier than it can manage. I built that company with Gus Hollifield. He died in that room. And you called the man he trained, the man who kept his life's work breathing, a glorified taste tester, in front of Arthur Vance. The line was quiet for 5 seconds. 5 seconds is a long time in a boardroom with 7 directors and a speakerphone. I'm asking for a vote, Walter said. Remove him. The vote was 6-1. Preston voted for himself. 6 directors voted to strip his title, effective immediately. Sandra Ellis was named interim CEO. Preston's equity stake, 12% of the company, gifted to him by Walter when he took the position, was subject to a clawback provision he apparently hadn't read. His severance was capped at 60 days. He left the building at 4:47 p.m., carrying a laptop bag and a box that didn't look heavy enough to hold 3.5 years of running a billion-dollar company. Dale texted me a photo at 5:03 p.m., the Braxton Creek parking lot, Preston's white Range Rover pulling out past the security gate. The guard and a man named Virgil Patterson, who'd worked that gate for 19 years, was standing at his post, watching the car leave. Dale said Virgil didn't wave. I was on my porch when I got that text. Martha was in the kitchen. The evening light was coming across the back. 40 at that angle. It gets in mid-June, when the sun drops low enough to turn the rickhouse lumber the color of dark honey. I could smell my own mash from the open fermenter in the garage, the same sweetness, corn and rye and that living warmth underneath. I looked at the photo for about 5 seconds. Then I set the phone on the arm of my chair and watched the light move. The consequences came in pieces over the following months, the way they do when something large falls apart. Braxton Creek's board hired a recovery distiller from a competitor in Bardstown. He spent 3 weeks with Crock No. 3 and produced a batch that scored 79, an improvement. Still 17 points below anything I'd ever released. The recovery distiller told Sandra Ellis, privately, that the strain had been irreversibly damaged by the forced cooling and overfeeding. "You can keep it alive," he said, "but it won't be what it was. That profile is gone." The Bourbon Press picked it up in July. A reviewer for the Kentucky Spirits Quarterly wrote a piece titled "The $1.4 billion Taste Test." The article named Preston by name. It named the flavor analytics platform by name. It quoted Arthur Vance. "I carried that label for 35 years because of one man's hands. They replaced those hands with a spreadsheet." Preston moved to New York in August. I heard through Dale that he was interviewing at consulting firms. I don't know if he got hired. I didn't ask. Braxton Creek's annual allocation in September sold 40% of inventory. The year before, it had sold out in 11 minutes. The stock closed the fiscal year down 38% from its October high. 2 analysts downgraded the company to hold. One used the phrase irreplaceable keyman risk, realized. Crock No. 3 is still alive, as far as I know. Producing, fermenting, making bourbon that someone will drink and think is fine. It is fine. Fine is what you get when the knowledge walks out the door and the algorithm stays behind. Walter Braxton called me on a Sunday morning in July. Martha answered, handed me the phone, and went out to the garden without a word. "Emmett." His voice was thin, tired. But he said my name the way he always had, with the weight of a man who meant it. Walter. I should have stopped it. I was sick, and I let the board hand him the keys, and I should have stopped it. You couldn't have known. I knew the day he called that thing an app. I knew then. He was quiet for a long time. I could hear his breathing, shallow and uneven. "Gus would have liked your label." "I think so, too." "You were the best hire he ever made." He told me that, the day he handed you that hydrometer. He called me that night and said, "Walter, I found the one." I didn't say anything. I held the phone and looked out the window at the rick house and felt the brass hydrometer in my jacket pocket where it always was, the patina warm from my body heat, the weight of it exactly right in my hand the way it had been right since 1989. "Thank you, Walter," I said. He hung up. That was the last time we spoke. Rawlings Reserve's second release went out in October, 500 bottles, scored 96 again, sold out in 48 hours. Arthur Vance placed it in 214 accounts across 11 states before Christmas. Frank Coleman had it in every premium bar in Atlanta by New Year's. By February, I had a wait list of my own, 12,000 names. For a distillery that was one man, one woman, a copper still built from pipe stock, and a ceramic crock in a temperature-controlled room on the back 40 of a property in Lawrenceburg, Kentucky. I wake up at 5 a.m. now, same as always. But I walk 40 feet instead of driving 22 miles. I open the door to the culture room and the smell hits me. Corn, rye, that living sweetness. And it's the same smell, the exact same smell. The yeast doesn't know it moved. It knows my hands. It knows the temperature of my palm and the angle of the feeding spoon and the flashlight held to the glaze at night when I'm reading the bubble pattern the way Gus taught me to read it in 1988. Claire drove down from Lexington last Saturday. She brought a bottle of wine and a loaf of bread, and she stood in the rick house doorway for a long time, looking at the barrels. "You built this," she said. "Your mother poured the pad." She smiled. Not a big smile, the kind her mother gives. You know what I mean. She walked through the rick house slowly, running her hand along the barrel staves the way I used to run my hand along the Crocks. She stopped at the corner office, saw the brass hydrometer on my desk next to the window that looked out over the back 40. "Gus's," she said. "Gus's." She picked it up. I turned it over in her hands, felt the patina, set it back down exactly where it had been. Then she looked at me. "It suits you here, Dad." 3 words, 4 if you count Dad. But she said it the way you say something you've been thinking for a long time and finally decided was true. Martha and I sat on the porch that evening after Claire left. The light came across the rick house and turned the lumber gold. I had a glass of Rawlings Reserve in my hand, the first pour from a barrel I'd filled myself, aged on my land, distilled through copper I'd bent and soldered in my own garage. The bourbon tasted like vanilla and scorched pecan, and a finish that I can only describe the way the reviewers always described it: cathedral oak. It tasted like Gus Hollifield would have recognized it, because it was the same thing. And the same living culture, the same hands, the same knowledge passed from one man to another in a room where the temperature mattered and the touch mattered, and nothing about it could be replaced by a platform or a pitch deck or a 28-year-old with a slide that said, "Scalable." Martha took a sip from my glass. She held it for a moment, nodded once. "That's the one," she said. I leaned back in my chair. The phone was inside, off. First time in 38 years I didn't carry it to the porch. Funny thing about yeast. It doesn't care who signs the paychecks. It doesn't read org charts or pitch decks or press releases about evolving flavor philosophy. It only knows what it's always known: the temperature of the room, the rhythm of the feeding, and the hands that show up at 3 a.m. when no one else will. You can't digitize that. Now, you can't scale it. You can't put it on a slide. You either have the hands or you don't. Gus knew that. I know it now. That's my story. If you've ever spent decades keeping something alive that someone else thought they could replace with a shortcut, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments. And if this one meant something to you, subscribe and hit the bell. There are more where this came from.